October 3rd, 2025. A pharmacist in a small town locks the door of a Rite Aid for the last time. No press conference, no farewell tour, just a sign taped to the glass. All Rite Aid stores have now closed. We thank our loyal customers for their many years of support. 63 years, gone, in one sentence. Rite Aid didn't die once, it died twice, 8 months apart. The first time, it walked out of bankruptcy court and told everyone it was saved. $4 billion in debt, wiped clean, a fresh start.
8 months later, it filed for bankruptcy again. And this time, there was no fresh start. There was only liquidation. Along the way, it left behind 1,600 lawsuits accusing it of helping fuel the deadliest drug crisis in American history. And buried inside those lawsuits is a detail most people never heard. According to federal prosecutors, Rite Aid didn't miss the warning signs. Its own pharmacists saw them. Its own internal data flagged them. And the company deleted the evidence. At its peak, this was a company with over 5,000 stores, stretched across dozens of states. A company nearly as recognizable as CVS or Walgreens. A company that, for millions of Americans, was simply where you went. For your prescriptions, for your shampoo, for a scoop of ice cream on the way out the door, if you grew up on the West Coast. It survived recessions. It survived the rise of Amazon. It survived decades of consolidation that wiped out smaller pharmacy chains one after another. And in the space of about 2 years, almost all of it came apart. This is the full story. The debt, the opioids, the 8 months that decided everything. In September of 1962, a man named Alex Grass opened a small discount store in Scranton, Pennsylvania. He called it Thrifty Discount Center. It wasn't a pharmacy, it was a general discount store, the kind that sold everything from toothpaste to toys. But Grass had a plan. He wanted to sell prescription drugs at discount prices, at a time when most independent pharmacies charged whatever they wanted, and small-town drugstores had almost no price competition to worry about. That idea, discount pricing applied to prescription medicine, was still fairly new in the early 1960s. Most Americans filled their prescriptions at small, independently owned pharmacies with no real chain behind them, and no negotiating power to bring prices down. Grass was betting that scale, buying in bulk, opening more locations, spreading costs across a bigger operation, could undercut all of them. In 1968, the company went public under a new name. Rite Aid. The pitch was simple: lower prices, more locations, and the convenience of a real pharmacy counter inside a store you'd already walk into anyway for toothpaste and greeting cards. It worked, better than almost anyone could have predicted. Through the 1970s and 1980s, Rite Aid grew the way most retail empires grow. Not by building slowly, by buying. In 1977, it acquired Reed's Drug Store. In 1987, Grey Drug. In 1988, Begley Drug Stores. Each acquisition added hundreds of locations overnight. Each one made Rite Aid a little more dominant, a little harder to compete with. Then, in 1996, came the deal that turned Rite Aid from a regional chain into a national one. Thrifty Payless, a 1,000-store chain across the West Coast. If you grew up in California, Oregon, or Washington in the 1990s, you probably remember it. Not for the pharmacy counter. For the ice cream. Thrifty Ice Cream, scooped in a distinctive cylinder shape, sold for $1 a scoop at the front of the store. For an entire generation of kids, Thrifty wasn't a drugstore. It was where you got ice cream after school. Rite Aid kept the brand alive inside its stores for decades. It became one of the company's most beloved, most recognizable pieces of Americana. The kind of small detail that made a pharmacy chain feel less like a corporation and more like a neighborhood fixture. By the late 1990s, Rite Aid operated thousands of stores stretching across most of the country, coast to coast, and it had become one of the 3 largest pharmacy chains in the United States. It had gone from a single discount store in Scranton to a genuine national institution in less than 4 decades. And it was about to make the biggest bet of its existence. By the mid-2000s, the American pharmacy business was consolidating fast. CVS and Walgreens were both getting bigger, both buying up regional chains, both racing to lock down prime real estate on street corners across the country. In an industry moving toward a handful of giant national players, standing still meant falling behind. In 2006, Rite Aid made a decision that would define the next 20 years of the company. It acquired the U.S. operations of Jean Coutu Group, a Canadian pharmacy company, along with two other major pharmacy chains it controlled, Eckerd and Brooks. The price tag, $3.4 billion. This wasn't a small bolt-on acquisition like the ones in the 1980s. This nearly doubled the size of the company overnight, adding well over 1,000 stores in a single transaction and pushing Rite Aid into direct, coast-to-coast competition with CVS and Walgreens for the first time. And just like Claire's with Apollo, and just like so many American retailers in this era, the growth came stapled to debt. Massive, permanent, structural debt, the kind that doesn't get paid off. It gets refinanced, restructured, and pushed down the road, year after year, for as long as the company can keep servicing the interest. By 2008, the strategy had paid off, at least on paper. Rite Aid operated 5,059 stores. It employed over 112,000 people. It generated $24.3 billion a year in revenue. Rite Aid was, by store count, one of the three largest pharmacy chains in America. Alongside CVS, alongside Walgreens, but underneath the 5,000 storefronts sat a debt load that would never fully go away. A debt load the company would spend the next 15 years trying, and failing, to escape. And that debt was about to collide with something far more dangerous than a bad balance sheet. Between the mid-2000s and the late 2010s, the United States was living through the deadliest drug epidemic in its history. Opioids, prescribed by doctors, filled by pharmacies, and in far too many cases, filled without the scrutiny the law required. Rite Aid became one of the pharmacy chains at the center of the crisis. Under federal law, pharmacies aren't just supposed to fill whatever prescription comes across the counter. They're required to watch for red flags. Patients paying cash for controlled substances instead of using insurance, prescriptions filled far too early to make medical sense, the same patient visiting multiple doctors for the same drug, a pattern regulators call doctor shopping. Pharmacists are the last checkpoint before a prescription becomes a pill in someone's hand, and the law expects them to act like it. Federal investigators alleged that Rite Aid filled prescriptions for opioids that were not, in the words of federal law, issued for a legitimate medical purpose by a practitioner acting in the usual course of professional practice. But this wasn't a case built on outside whistleblowers catching Rite Aid off guard. On March 13, 2023, the Department of Justice filed a civil complaint that made a much sharper accusation. Rite Aid knew. According to the complaint, between May of 2014 and June of 2019, Rite Aid pharmacists filled thousands of prescriptions for suspicious quantities and combinations of opioids, ones that carried the exact red flags pharmacists are trained to catch. Cash payments for controlled substances. Prescriptions filled dangerously early, the same patients showing up with prescriptions from multiple doctors for the same drugs. And the government's evidence for how obvious the pattern was didn't come from outsiders. It came from Rite Aid itself, from its own pharmacists, who raised concerns internally, from its own distributor, who flagged suspicious ordering patterns, and from Rite Aid's own internal data systems, which tracked the prescribers generating the red flags in the first place. Then the complaint went further. Prosecutors alleged that Rite Aid destroyed the evidence of what it knew. Internal notes flagging suspicious prescribers, the kind pharmacists are supposed to keep, were allegedly deleted. One of the notes investigators recovered anyway read simply, "Cash-only pill mill?" A pharmacist's own words, flagging a prescriber, in real time. The complaint also alleged that company managers instructed staff to be careful about what they put in writing when it came to suspicious prescribing, guidance that, if true, reads less like compliance policy and more like an instruction not to leave a paper trail. That complaint was filed 7 months before Rite Aid's first bankruptcy. The government wasn't a distant, abstract threat by the time the company collapsed in October 2023. It was a plaintiff, in federal court, with a paper trail of Rite Aid's own internal warnings, publicly on the record, months before the first Chapter 11 filing. This wasn't happening in a vacuum. Across the country, cities and counties were burying an entire generation of overdose victims, and local governments were spending millions on emergency response, treatment programs, and foster care for children whose parents didn't survive the epidemic. Somebody had to pay for that. And prosecutors, city attorneys, and county governments across the country decided the pharmacies that filled the prescriptions belonged on that list, right alongside the manufacturers who made the pills and the distributors who shipped them. The lawsuits piled up, city after city, county after county, state after state, all alleging the same pattern. By the time Rite Aid filed for bankruptcy, more than 1,600 separate lawsuits were pending against the company over its role in the opioid crisis, one of the largest blocks of pending litigation attached to any single retailer in the country. In July of 2024, the Department of Justice announced a settlement. Rite Aid agreed to pay $7.5 million in cash, plus accept a $401.8 million unsecured claim inside its ongoing bankruptcy case. A total settlement value of roughly $408 million. It was one of several settlements pharmacy chains would pay in these years. But for Rite Aid, it landed at the worst possible moment, in the middle of a fight for its own survival. The opioid liability didn't bankrupt Rite Aid by itself, but it became a permanent weight, sitting on top of a company that was already buckling under debt from an acquisition made almost 2 decades earlier. And unlike the debt, which was just a bad bet, this part of the story wasn't about a company that failed to see trouble coming. The evidence says Rite Aid saw it, from inside its own pharmacies, and chose not to act on it. Through the 2010s, Rite Aid was no longer expanding. It was surviving. Competitors CVS and Walgreens had bigger footprints, better real estate deals, and stronger relationships with pharmacy benefit managers, the powerful middlemen who sit between insurers, drug manufacturers, and pharmacies, and who negotiate what a store actually gets paid every time it fills a prescription. The bigger the chain, the more leverage it had in those negotiations. Rite Aid, stuck in third place, had the least leverage of the three. At the same time, the ground itself was shifting under every pharmacy chain in America, not just Rite Aid. Mail-order pharmacy services were growing. Amazon had entered the prescription drug business, offering home delivery that didn't require a single trip to a physical counter. Insurers were increasingly steering customers toward whichever pharmacy offered them the best negotiated rate, not necessarily the one on the corner they'd used for 20 years. Foot traffic that used to walk into a Rite Aid almost by default now had other, cheaper, more convenient options. Even Rite Aid's much larger rivals felt this pressure. Walgreens and CVS would both go on, in the years that followed, to close hundreds of their own underperforming stores and restructure their own operations. The entire brick-and-mortar pharmacy model in America was under strain. But CVS and Walgreens had the size, the cash reserves, and the diversified businesses, insurance arms, health clinics, distribution networks, to absorb years of pressure that a smaller, more indebted Rite Aid simply couldn't. In 2018, Rite Aid made a move that signaled, to anyone paying attention, exactly where things were headed. It sold roughly 1,900 of its stores to Walgreens. The company that once operated over 5,000 locations was down to around 2,100. It wasn't framed as a retreat. It was framed as a strategic refocus. But strip away the language, and the math was simple. Rite Aid was shrinking, on purpose, because it could no longer compete at its old size. The debt from 2006 hadn't gone anywhere. The opioid lawsuits were mounting. And now the company itself was smaller, with less revenue to service the same enormous obligations. Something had to give. On October 15, 2023, Rite Aid filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. 7 months earlier, the Department of Justice had already put its own internal warnings on the public record, in federal court, in that March 2023 complaint. By the time the bankruptcy filing came, anyone who'd been paying attention to that lawsuit already knew the outline of what was coming. The company cited 3 things directly: a large debt load, thousands of lawsuits tied to the opioid crisis, and a restructuring effort that had failed to fix either problem. At the time of filing, Rite Aid was carrying $4 billion in funded debt. The company secured $3.5 billion in new financing to keep operating during the bankruptcy process, and it began closing stores immediately. Roughly 500 locations shut down as part of the restructuring, each one a real store, in a real neighborhood, with real employees who found out their branch wasn't making the cut, and real customers who suddenly had to find a new pharmacy for the medications they depended on every month. Bankruptcy court is, at its core, a negotiation over who gets paid and in what order. Bondholders, lenders, landlords, vendors, and the lawyers representing 1,600 opioid lawsuits, all fighting over a company that didn't have enough value left to satisfy everyone. Rite Aid needed a deal that all of these parties could live with, or the whole process would collapse into a straight liquidation right then, in 2023, 2 years earlier than it eventually happened. For almost a year, Rite Aid worked through Chapter 11, negotiating with creditors, cutting costs, selling off pieces of the business that weren't core to the pharmacy operation. Trying to build a version of the company that could survive with fewer stores and less debt. On September 3, 2024, it emerged. The headline numbers looked, on the surface, like a genuine turnaround. Roughly $2 billion in debt eliminated. $2.5 billion in new exit financing secured. The company down to about 1,250 stores, a fraction of its old size, but debt light, and ready for a second act. Rite Aid told the public, and its remaining employees, that the worst was over. It had 8 months to prove that was true. What happened between September 2024 and May 2025 is, in some ways, the most important part of this story. Because it's the part that shows bankruptcy doesn't fix a business. It only buys time. Rite Aid emerged from Chapter 11 lighter on debt, but it walked straight into a set of problems that debt relief alone couldn't solve. And this is the part of the story most headlines skipped, because company emerges from bankruptcy, made for a clean, positive story. What happened next did not. Vendors, spooked by the bankruptcy, tightened their terms. Suppliers who once gave Rite Aid 30 or 60 days to pay for a shipment began demanding payment in advance, before the goods even left the warehouse. That meant Rite Aid needed more cash, upfront, just to keep operating at the same scale it had before, at the exact moment it had the least cash to spare. Inventory started thinning out. Customers walked into stores and found empty shelves where products used to be, the kind of thing that quietly trains a shopper to go somewhere else next time, without ever making headlines itself. Sales kept declining, labor costs kept climbing, and pharmacy reimbursement rates, what insurers and pharmacy benefit managers actually pay a store for filling a prescription, kept getting squeezed lower, a pressure hitting every pharmacy chain in the country, but one Rite Aid, weaker and smaller than its rivals, could least afford to absorb. By November of 2024, just 2 months after emerging from bankruptcy, Rite Aid's adjusted earnings had turned negative. And they stayed negative, month after month, all the way into the following spring. The company that had just told the world it was saved was, quietly, already failing again. Nobody outside the company was watching closely enough yet to notice. On May 5, 2025, Rite Aid filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy for the second time in 19 months. Counted from the day it first walked into bankruptcy court back in October of 2023. Just 8 months from the day it walked out, promising a fresh start. This time, the company carried roughly $2.161 billion in funded debt into the case. Less than the $4 billion from 2023, but still enough to be fatal for a company this fragile, this soon after its last brush with collapse. And this time, there was no talk of restructuring. No talk of emerging leaner and stronger. No promise of a second fresh start. Rite Aid announced it would sell all of its assets and close all of its remaining pharmacies. There would not be a third act. Over the following months, Rite Aid's remaining footprint was carved up and sold off, piece by piece, to the competitors that had outlasted it. Not sold as a company. Sold as parts. CVS acquired roughly 625 prescription files across 15 states. Walgreens picked up additional locations. So did Albertsons, Kroger, Giant Eagle, and Weis Markets, regional grocery chains absorbing whatever pharmacy business was left in their territory. In total, more than 1,000 pharmacy assets, prescriptions, patient records, and store leases moved from Rite Aid to its rivals. A slow-motion liquidation stretched across months, store by store, region by region, until there was almost nothing left to sell. Even the Thrifty Ice Cream brand, the one piece of pure nostalgia left in the company, the dollar scoop that an entire generation on the West Coast grew up with, was sold off during the bankruptcy proceedings. Another asset on another spreadsheet. And there's a bitter footnote buried in all of this. That $401.8 million unsecured claim from the opioid settlement, the one meant to compensate the government and, indirectly, communities devastated by the crisis, was just one more unsecured claim standing in line behind secured lenders when the second bankruptcy hit. In a liquidation, unsecured creditors are almost always last to get paid, and often paid only cents on the dollar, if anything at all. The company that was supposed to help make the opioid crisis right ran out of money before it could. On October 3, 2025, the final 89 Rite Aid stores closed their doors. 63 years after Alex Grass opened a discount store in Scranton, Pennsylvania, the company that grew out of it ceased to exist. Look at the full arc, and a pattern starts to repeat. A company builds something real, grows it through acquisition, finance with debt it assumes it can always outgrow. For a while, it works. The store count climbs, the revenue climbs, and nobody questions the debt sitting quietly underneath all of it. Then two things happen at once. The debt stops being manageable, and something else, something the company can't debt restructure its way out of, arrives at the same time. For Claire's, it was private equity control and 2 ignored warnings from the outside. A creditor who saw the endgame years in advance and got ignored. For Rite Aid, the warning didn't come from outside. It came from inside its own pharmacies, its own pharmacists, its own distributor, its own data. And according to federal prosecutors, instead of acting on it, the company deleted it. That internal warning, ignored and allegedly erased, became a federal complaint 7 months before the first bankruptcy, and one more permanent weight on top of a balance sheet that had already been fragile for 15 years, in a competitive landscape that had already left Rite Aid in 3rd place. Bankruptcy bought Rite Aid 8 months of breathing room. It did not buy it a future. Because the underlying business, the vendor relationships, the shrinking margins, the competition it could no longer keep pace with, never actually got fixed. It just got a temporary discount, dressed up as a comeback. 8 months after walking out of bankruptcy court promising a fresh start, Rite Aid was back in the same courtroom asking to shut down completely. Not restructure, not survive smaller, shut down completely. 63 years, a national footprint of 5,000 stores at its peak, and a brand that fed generations of American kids their after-school ice cream. All of it ended not with a dramatic collapse, but with a sign taped to a door, and a company thanking its customers on the way out. There's a lesson in here for anyone who assumes bankruptcy is a reset button. It isn't, it's a negotiation, a temporary ceasefire between a company and the people it owes money to. It buys time, it does not buy a working business model. And if the underlying problems, the debt, the competition, the liabilities that never went away, are still sitting there when the ceasefire ends, the second collapse can come faster and harder than anyone expects. 8 months, in Rite Aid's case, was all it took. If a company can go bankrupt, promise it's fixed, and then collapse again in under a year, hit subscribe to Sunset Clause. We track exactly how long a fresh start actually lasts before it fails. Drop a comment. Which company do you think is next to go bankrupt twice? I read every single one.